The room is silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind that exists only when history is about to change. Every eye is fixed. Every breath feels heavier than the last. In this single moment, one step is about to break rules that have stood for centuries. Not with weapons, not with rebellion, but simply with presence. Outside, critics are waiting for failure. Supporters are holding their breath. And inside, one woman knows that after this moment, nothing will ever be the same again. This is not just a victory. This is a challenge to an entire system. A door is about to open that was never built for her. And once that door opens, the world will never be able to close it again. Before this moment, the world of Western democracy was shaped almost entirely by men. Parliaments, cabinets, prime ministers, presidents. For generations, leadership was spoken in a male voice, written in male names, designed around male expectations. Democracy, for all its promises, still carried invisible barriers. Women could vote in many countries. Women could work. Women could speak. But leading a Western democracy was considered something different, something unreachable, something that belonged to tradition, not change. The political world was built on old habits, old networks, old assumptions about who looked like a leader. Power was not just about votes, it was about perception. And for decades, perception said leadership looked a certain way. The idea of a woman leading a Western democratic nation was not openly banned. It was quietly dismissed, not written into law, but written into culture. Long before the rise of this historic leader, women had already been fighting for space. Suffrage movements had shaken societies. World wars had forced women into factories, offices, and decision-making roles. Education had opened doors that were once closed. But politics remained one of the last strongholds. Campaigns were brutal. Media coverage was unforgiving. Public scrutiny was relentless. And for women, the standards were different. Men were judged on policy. Women were judged on appearance, tone, family, and personality. A strong man was seen as decisive. A strong woman was often labeled as difficult. A calm man was seen as stable. A calm woman was sometimes called weak. This was the environment that shaped the path ahead. Not just a political challenge, a cultural one. Her early life did not begin with power. It began with ordinary routines. School mornings, family expectations, small moments that did not yet carry global meaning. But even early on, there were signs. An interest in debate, a willingness to speak when others stayed quiet, a focus on responsibility, not for attention, but for impact. In classrooms and early professional life, she learned a difficult lesson. Being prepared was not enough. She had to be better prepared, because mistakes would not be forgiven easily, because success would not be assumed. She learned to sharpen her arguments, to stay calm under pressure, to master details others ignored, not for praise, but for survival in a system that was not built for her. Entering politics was not a smooth decision. It came with resistance, doubt, questions that male candidates were rarely asked. Could she handle pressure? Could she balance leadership and personal life? Could she command respect? These questions were not about ability. They were about tradition. Early campaigns were hard. Every speech was analyzed. Every expression was judged. Support was mixed with skepticism. Some voters were inspired. Others were uncomfortable, not because of her ideas, but because of what she represented. Change. Change always makes people uneasy. There were defeats, setbacks, moments when stepping away might have been easier, but each setback added something important: experience, resilience, a deeper understanding of how power really worked. She learned that political systems are not just rules on paper. They are relationships, they are trust, they are timing. And slowly, momentum began to build. Supporters grew louder. Skeptics became quieter. What once seemed impossible started to look unlikely, and then, suddenly, possible. The turning point did not come quietly. It came during a moment of political uncertainty, economic pressure, public frustration, a desire for something different. Voters were no longer just choosing policies. They were choosing direction. They were choosing symbols. And for the first time, a woman was not just part of the conversation. She was leading it. The campaign carried weight beyond party lines, beyond ideology. It became a test of whether democracy could truly reflect the people it represented. Media attention exploded. International observers watched closely. Supporters saw history. Opponents warned of risk. But the momentum could not be stopped. The election result was more than a win. It was a signal to her country, to other democracies, to millions of women watching around the world. The moment she took office, the meaning went far beyond one nation. She was not just a leader, she became a symbol. Not a symbol of perfection, but a symbol of possibility. Her leadership was watched with a microscope. Every decision, every speech, every mistake. Because when you are the first, you are never just yourself. You represent what others will believe is possible next. She faced challenges that had nothing to do with gender, economic decisions, foreign policy crises, domestic reforms, but she also carried an invisible burden, knowing that failure would not just be hers, it would be used as proof that the experiment should never be repeated. That pressure was enormous. She had to lead carefully, not cautiously, but consciously. She had to prove that leadership did not depend on gender. It depended on judgment, preparation, and resolve. There were conflicts, political rivals, media storms, moments when criticism turned personal. Her appearance was discussed alongside her policies. Her tone was analyzed more than her ideas. But she continued, not because it was easy, but because stepping back would mean confirming old beliefs. Behind closed doors, the stress was real. Long nights, difficult choices, lonely moments that never made headlines. Leadership at that level is never simple, but being the first made it heavier. Still, progress was made. Policies were passed. Voices were heard. Barriers were weakened. Not all goals were achieved. Not all decisions were perfect. History rarely offers perfect leaders. What it offers are turning points, and this was one. Other women around the world began to see something different, not a distant dream, but a visible path. Political parties began to reconsider candidates. Voters began to reconsider assumptions. Young girls began to imagine futures that had no clear example before. The impact could not be measured only in laws. It was measured in mindset. Eventually, her time in office came to an end, as all leadership terms do. But the story did not end there, because the real change was not just in who held power, it was in who was now seen as capable of holding it. The system had been tested, and it had adapted. Her legacy was not built on perfection, it was built on courage, on entering a space that was never designed for her, and staying. Her name became part of political history, but more importantly, as her leadership continued, something subtle but powerful began to happen. The public conversation slowly shifted. At first, many discussions were still about her gender, but over time, more discussions became about her decisions. This shift mattered because it meant the role was slowly becoming normal. Not easy, not free from bias, but less shocking. And in politics, what becomes normal becomes possible for others. Her presence changed how leadership looked on television screens, in newspapers, in history books. For the first time, millions of people saw a woman not as an exception, but as a sitting leader making real choices. This visibility had ripple effects in universities, in political parties, in local governments. Young women began to see politics not as a closed door, but as a difficult door that could be opened. But visibility also brought pressure, because being visible means being targeted. Critics became louder, opposition became sharper. Every mistake became a headline. Every delay became a controversy. Some attacks were political, others were personal. Questions about leadership were mixed with comments about style, emotion, and personality. These were not new tactics. They were old patterns simply applied in a new situation. She had to develop a thick emotional armor, not to ignore criticism, but to separate real accountability from noise. Inside government, negotiations were complex. Allies did not automatically cooperate. Opponents did not suddenly soften. Being historic did not make governing easier. In some ways, it made it harder. There was no roadmap, no previous example to follow. Every decision created a precedent. This meant that even small choices carried symbolic weight. How she responded to crisis, how she handled disagreement, how she balanced firmness with diplomacy. These moments were studied by observers around the world. Foreign leaders watched closely. Some were supportive, some were skeptical, some were openly dismissive. In international meetings, she represented not just her country, she represented a shift in global norms. In rooms filled with men who had led for decades, her presence quietly changed the dynamic. Not always comfortably, not always smoothly, but change rarely is. At home, her leadership style became a subject of debate. Was it too firm, too careful, too different, too similar? The truth was simpler. She was governing in a system that had never fully prepared for someone like her. That meant resistance did not always come from opposition parties. Sometimes it came from inside institutions themselves. Old habits, old expectations, old informal networks. Breaking into these systems required more than authority. It required patience, persistence, and strategic thinking. She learned when to push, when to wait, when to compromise, and when to stand firm. Not because of weakness, but because long-term change often requires timing. Behind public speeches, there were private doubts, not about her goals, but about how much could realistically be changed. Leadership is often portrayed as confidence. In reality, it is often a series of difficult trade-offs. Every decision helps some and disappoints others. Every reform creates new tensions. She had to accept that being the first also meant being judged by impossible standards. She was expected to succeed where systems themselves had struggled. Despite this, moments of real progress appeared. Policies that improved lives, programs that opened doors, reforms that reshaped conversations. Not all of these were dramatic. Some were quiet, incremental, but lasting. These changes did not always make headlines, but they made a difference in daily life. Slowly, her leadership became less about novelty and more about normal governance. That, in itself, was a victory. Because when something becomes normal, it becomes repeatable. But the pressure never fully disappeared. Public trust is fragile. Political patience is limited. Media attention is relentless. Any misstep could be magnified. Any delay could be framed as failure. This constant scrutiny created a unique burden, not just for her, but for what she represented. Some supporters feared that if she failed, doors might close again. Some critics waited for proof that the experiment was a mistake. This is the unfair reality of being the first. You are not just allowed to fail as an individual. Your failure is used as a general rule. She carried this knowledge quietly. It did not appear in speeches. It did not appear in interviews, but it shaped how carefully she moved. Her leadership was not about dramatic gestures. It was about endurance. Day after day, decision after decision, staying in the room, staying at the table, staying in the conversation. Over time, something deeper happened. The conversation about leadership itself began to change. Commentators began to compare her to male leaders without mentioning gender first. Criticism became more policy-focused. Praise became more results-based. This shift was subtle, but powerful. It meant that leadership was slowly being redefined, not as male, not as female, but as leadership. This did not erase inequality. It did not solve structural bias, but it cracked a long-standing wall, and cracks are how walls eventually fall. As her term progressed, the political environment evolved. New challenges appeared, economic shifts, global tensions, domestic debates. She had to adapt, not as a symbol, but as a working leader. Some decisions aged well, others became controversial with time. This is the reality of governance. History rarely offers clean verdicts. What it offers are patterns, influence, and long-term consequences. As the end of her leadership approached, attention shifted, not just to what she had done, but to what came next. Would another woman follow, or would the door quietly close again? Her legacy was no longer just her own. It had become a test for the system itself. As time passed, the weight of being the first became heavier in ways that were not always visible to the public. History does not only move through speeches and votes, it also moves through exhaustion, through private moments of doubt, through the slow emotional toll of constant pressure. Public leadership creates a public image, but behind that image is a private human being. Every major decision carried two burdens, the burden of national consequences and the burden of symbolic meaning. If a policy succeeded, it was seen as progress. If it failed, it was often framed as proof. Proof for critics who had always believed she did not belong there. This double standard was never written into law, but it was deeply felt. Male leaders had failed before. They were remembered as flawed individuals. She was at risk of being remembered as a flawed example. This invisible pressure shaped her leadership style. She became careful with words, precise with timing, measured in tone, not because she lacked conviction, but because every sentence could be weaponized. Inside her own party, support was not always unanimous. Some saw her as an asset. Others saw her as a risk, not because of her policies alone, but because of what her presence represented. Power structures are slow to change, even when they appear to support change. Behind closed doors, alliances were negotiated, not just on policy, but on perception. She had to constantly prove competence, not once, but repeatedly. Competence was not assumed. It had to be demonstrated again and again. This reality shaped how she prepared. Longer briefings, deeper preparation, more detailed knowledge. She walked into rooms more prepared than many before her, not for advantage, but for survival, because mistakes would not be forgiven easily. At times, this created distance between her and colleagues, between her and the public. Some interpreted caution as coldness. Some interpreted discipline as lack of warmth. These judgments revealed more about expectations than about leadership. Leadership had long been associated with a narrow image, a voice, a posture, a personality type. She did not always fit that image, so instead of changing the image, critics tried to reshape her, but she did not fully bend. Instead, she slowly expanded what leadership could look like. Quiet authority, firm calm, strategic patience, not loud, not theatrical, but steady. Over time, this steadiness became a strength. In moments of crisis, her tone mattered. Markets watched, allies listened, opponents analyzed. In these moments, symbolism faded. Only results mattered. This was when her leadership was tested most seriously, not as a first, but as a leader. Decisions made in pressure would later be debated for years. Some praised them as responsible. Some criticized them as cautious. Some said they were too slow. Others said they were too bold. History rarely gives a simple verdict. What history does show is context, what options were available, what risks were present, what information was known at the time. She made decisions inside uncertainty, like every leader. But unlike most leaders, her uncertainty was often interpreted as weakness. This is one of the most unfair parts of being first. Your hesitation is not seen as thoughtfulness, it is seen as doubt. Still, she continued, day after day, meeting after meeting, negotiation after negotiation. The public saw outcomes. They did not see the process. They did not see the late nights, the endless documents, the constant weighing of consequences. Leadership is not cinematic in real life. It is repetitive, exhausting, and often thankless. As her leadership continued, something unexpected happened. The novelty began to fade. Media coverage slowly shifted. Headlines became less about gender, more about economics, foreign policy, domestic reform. This was a quiet victory. It meant that her presence had become normalized, not celebrated as an exception, not criticized as an experiment, but accepted as part of the political landscape. Normalization is one of the most powerful forms of change, because once something becomes normal, it becomes less reversible. Future leaders would not face the same shock factor. They would face resistance. They would face criticism, but not the same disbelief. This was one of her most lasting impacts, even if it was rarely acknowledged directly. Yet normalization did not mean protection. As political cycles turned, new opponents emerged, new narratives formed, new pressures built. Every leader eventually faces the reality of limits. Political capital fades, public patience shifts, economic conditions change. Her leadership entered a new phase, not of expansion, but of defense. Defending previous gains, defending credibility, defending stability. This phase is often less dramatic, but more emotionally draining. It is easier to build momentum than to maintain it. She had to manage expectations. Supporters wanted faster change. Opponents wanted reversal. Standing in the middle meant satisfying no one fully. This is where leadership becomes loneliest, not because people disappear, but because decisions become heavier. She could not please everyone. She could not avoid backlash. She could only choose what she believed would matter most in the long term. As her time in office moved closer to its end, the tone around her shifted again. Observers began to speak of legacy, of firsts, of historical impact. This created a strange emotional moment. On one hand, there was recognition. On the other, there was exhaustion. Being historic is not restful. It means your story is constantly being written, edited, debated. She had to live inside a narrative she did not fully control. Her own identity became mixed with public interpretation. Some saw her as a hero, some as a disappointment, some as a symbol, some as a cautionary tale. Rarely was she allowed to be seen simply as human. Yet even in this, her impact remained, because every debate about her leadership was also a debate about possibility. Could a woman lead at the highest level? Not in theory, but in reality. Her very presence forced that question to be answered in practice, and practice matters more than theory. When her leadership finally came to an end, the world moved on quickly. New leaders, new headlines, new crises. This is how history works. But the door she opened did not close. Others walked through, not always immediately, not without resistance, but the idea was no longer unthinkable. That is how deep change works, not with instant transformation, but with permanent possibility. As her time in leadership came to a close, the atmosphere around her changed once again. Not with applause alone, not with criticism alone, but with reflection. History has a way of slowing down after great moments pass. The noise fades, the urgency softens, and what remains is perspective. In the final phase of her leadership, attention shifted from daily politics to long-term meaning. People began to ask a different kind of question, not just what she did, but what she changed forever. The systems she worked within had existed long before her. They would exist long after her, but they were no longer exactly the same, because once a barrier is crossed, it cannot be unseen. Her departure from office did not erase her presence, it transformed it. She became part of history rather than current events. This is where leaders gain a second life, not in speeches, not in votes, but in memory, and memory is powerful. Young women who had watched her rise were now older. Some had entered politics, some had entered law, some had entered business. Some had simply changed how they saw themselves. They no longer grew up in a world where leadership was imagined only one way. They had seen it done differently. This did not mean equality was achieved. It meant the argument against possibility had weakened. That is a quiet revolution. History books would later debate her decisions. They would analyze her policies. They would rank her leadership among others. Some judgments would be fair. Some would be shaped by politics. Some would be shaped by emotion. That is unavoidable. But beneath all debate, one fact would remain untouched. She had changed the frame. Before her, leadership at the highest level was described in hypotheticals. After her, it was described in precedent. Precedent is more powerful than promise because it proves that something has already happened, and what has already happened can happen again. Over time, the conversation about her leadership matured. It became less about novelty, more about complexity. This is a sign of true historical integration, when a person is no longer treated as an exception, but as a full participant in the long story of power, struggle, and decision. Her name became part of a larger narrative, not isolated, but connected to other leaders, other movements, other shifts in social thinking. She was no longer only the first, she was one of many who shaped a changing era. And yet, being first always leaves a deeper mark, because the first absorbs more resistance, more doubt, more pressure. Later leaders benefit from the path already cut. She had walked through uncertainty so others would not have to walk through the same darkness. That is the unseen cost of being first. It is not just achievement, it is endurance. In private life after leadership, she carried something few people understand: the strange silence after power, the absence of constant attention, the sudden space where decisions once filled every hour. For some, this is relief. For others, it is loss. Leadership becomes identity, and identity does not disappear when the title does. Yet even outside office, her presence remained symbolic. She was invited to speak, asked to advise, asked to reflect, not only on policy, but on experience, on what it means to lead while being watched not just as a person, but as a symbol. This dual existence never fully leaves. She had carried it while in power, she carried it after, and in doing so, she gave voice to a reality many had never considered, that leadership is not just authority, it is emotional labor, cultural negotiation, psychological endurance. Her story revealed something deeper than politics. It revealed how societies test those who challenge tradition, not with one barrier, but with many small pressures, subtle, constant, exhausting. Yet her survival within that system changed the system itself, not by destroying it, but by stretching it, making it larger, more inclusive, more flexible. That is how real progress often happens, not with dramatic collapse, but with quiet expansion. Today, when people speak about leadership, the language has shifted, the image has broadened, not fully, not perfectly, but enough that the old certainty is gone. And once certainty is gone, change becomes possible. This is her deepest legacy, not a single law, not a single speech, not a single decision, but a permanent change in imagination, what people believe leadership can look like, what young minds believe is realistic, what societies no longer find shocking. That kind of change does not make headlines, but it shapes generations. If you want to explore more stories that reveal how single moments reshape the course of human history, make sure to subscribe to Chronos X documentary for deep, cinematic history that goes beyond the surface. In the end, history will not remember her only as the first woman. It will remember her as a person who stood inside a system that was not built for her. And led anyway. Not perfectly, not without controversy, not without mistakes, but with presence, with endurance, with undeniable reality. She did not just step into history. She forced history to make room. And in doing so, she left behind something more powerful than a title. She left behind a door that can never again be fully closed. That is what it truly means to change the world. Not to be remembered forever, but to make it easier for others to step forward. And that is how the future quietly begins.